Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. This season, we're having sweaty conversations for change. We're talking with guests about uncomfortable conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion needed to pivot towards positive change. We do this podcast because it's important that all voices are heard, all people are seen, and all people feel a sense of belonging in their workplaces. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm so excited to have a friend and a colleague I've gotten to know over the last year on. It's always good to be with like-minded allies. And we have with us today, Philip Rose, and he is in leadership development consulting based out of the UK. His purpose is to lead organizations or those aspiring to find their purpose. And he helps people set up and achieve what they're truly capable of. So I love that bio. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Julie. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to be talking to you on this side of the mic as well. So thank you for having me back.
Yeah. And Phil and I got to talk on his podcast. So we'll be sure to link to that and share those resources because he's got a tremendous podcast on everything from like how to develop a good culture to organizational change and the importance of leadership globally. So we're going to get into all that. But before we do that, Phil, we always like to start with a candid conversation you've had about diversity. And Phil is a white man, a straight white man, presumably with a wife. And, you know, I think it's always fun to hear that perspective. So tell us what kind of conversations you're having about diversity.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting one. And it's, I live in a small village outside of Oxford in England. So I'm in the middle of the countryside. I'm 10 miles from Oxford and I'm probably 40 miles north of London. So it's in a fairly rural area with a lot of people who pre-pandemic used to commute into London. But now there's a lot more people here. And I think you said about what conversations we're having. Oxford is a very multicultural area. If ever you've been to Oxford, if your listeners have, it's a tourist attraction, but a lot of people come here to study. And a lot of people see Oxford as a very wealthy area as well. And that's where I think some of the conversations we have really come to bear, because actually we find Oxford has got some of the biggest levels of deprivation in it in the world. And it may seem really strange when you say that, and I say in world, I'm maybe exaggerating when I say that, but basically in the UK, if you look at Oxford, it's a city of two halves. And I think the conversations we're having around is how can that be when you've got a lot of very intelligent people who come to Oxford University to study, and there's a lot of wealth overtly on the streets, but then you go around the behinds and there's a lot of homeless people as well. And I find that a really shocking conversation to have. And I know it's diversity in a different lens, but I think it's about how do you bring everybody into the conversation?
That haves and have-nots. That system, like that divide happens so much here in the US in our cities. I mean, where I live, very affluent, more white-dominated community, 3 miles, just 3 miles down the road, you go inside the outer belt of our highway system, and it's a very diverse community. And I think similar, it sounds like similar where you live, you're a few miles from Oxford, where it's a very white community, very affluent community. I think the question becomes, how do we have conversations about diversity when there's not diversity in our own communities?
Yeah. And I think that's it. You said about the candid conversations, and you know, I'm a father of 2 daughters, and both daughters challenge me in different ways. But my youngest daughter, who's 15, I think she's the challenger in the family, and she is going to stand up for female rights more than anybody else I've met, because she's just so passionate about having that conversation about diversity from a female perspective. But I think it's interesting when we talk about people of color, because I think one thing I've noticed in the younger people today, and I'm 51 on Monday, there we go. And I think the younger people I talk to, they see people of color as just people. And I think it's really interesting when I look at my daughter, they just get on with people in a very different way to we were brought up. I mean, I'm a child of the 70s in the UK. And I think we have a very different perspective growing up to my young daughter now in the centre of Oxford. She's openly there as a female, pushing herself forward and questioning what role females play in society. And it should be equal. And I see this as a farmer now, and I'm thinking, Of course it should be equal. Why isn't it? So I've now having these questions bounded at me in the evenings about why do people do that? Why do people catcall girls on the streets? And, it shocks me. And I think that's the type of conversation that we all should be having more of.
Yeah, yeah, those your daughter sounds like a really bright star for diversity. And I think this next generation we know has experienced more diversity, certainly not enough. And exposure doesn't solve all of that challenge, but it helps open your eyes to that.
Yeah.
And like you said, it kind of normalizes people of color isn't so rare. Like you and I were talking like when you notice someone different on the street
Yeah.
or you said at the beach, it's like, oh, do I like go up to them and be like, hey, I want you to feel welcome? And I know in my community that feels a little weird, right? Like I really want to see more people of color. I want to see diversity. And when I do, I get really excited. I want to say something, but then I don't want to single that person out. It makes it
Yeah.
feel strange too.
And I think this is interesting, isn't it? I was thinking, and you were talking about candid conversations. So I'm going to be really open with you here. My first girlfriend was a Sri Lankan girl many years ago in the early 1980s. My first girlfriend. So she was of Sri Lankan origin, Sri Lankan heritage. And I remember when my parents, my dad, who's a white middle class man, met my girlfriend's parents, and they were black. And it was a really interesting shock on my, not so much a shock, but there was a culture clash there. And I do remember that conversation. And me and my girlfriend at the time had these conversations after about it. It shouldn't have been so because we were together. And, my wife now is white and, we've been together 20 odd years now. But that first girlfriend was a black girl. And it was just that interesting conversation when the parents met. That was in
Yeah.
Southampton. And that's just that difference.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily bad, but there is a shock factor.
Yeah.
I've had that
Yeah.
happen to me professionally and personally, where you're just expecting, someone to be white and they happen to be a person of color. And you're like, oh, I just wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that shock factor, I think that's unfair for so many reasons because they feel it, they see it, they notice your body language. And it's just a skin color, right? It could be a cultural difference too. But, for the most part, like we're human beings, we're all human. And why can't we just see each other as a common
Yeah.
humanity?
And that thing about we're all human beings, that's what works with me, I think now. I coach people, and I've been very lucky to coach people all around the world over the last few years. Through the benefit of Zoom or Teams. I don't have to leave my rural community to be able to reach out. So I've coached and been coached by someone in Shanghai. I've coached someone in Tokyo. I've been coaching a gentleman in Mumbai. I've been coaching a lady in Bahrain. And when I think about coaching those individuals, the thing that's come to me is we're all the same, and we all should know that. And I look at, you talk about purpose, and my purpose being about leadership and development. My purpose actually is to inspire people to be the people they truly can be. And I think what I've noticed is some people, and we all see this, have a tendency to knock themselves back because they don't believe they're good enough, or they don't believe they're able to do something. And for me, part of my journey is actually to help people recognize the strength they all have and the beauty within. So in my coaching world, where I'm reaching out to people across the world effectively, because we can do it, I'm saying, hey, you're a person and you've got all this beauty inside you. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. Be proud of your heritage, be proud of what you've got, and let's let it shine. And I think that's the thing that I see in my coaching, is helping people step up and recognize their own uniqueness and their difference, and use that for their own benefit and everyone else's.
Yeah. Yeah. Often that uniqueness gets stifled, because you're in a group, you're in an organization that has a majority group in power
Yeah.
in leadership, and a lot of them look like you. And so we kind of learn how to speak more masculine and how to speak more white and, whatever that means for your organization. That's by not all means globally accurate, but for the most part, that's what leadership teams look like of global companies. And I think sometimes for white men, it's hard to understand what that would feel like to not see yourself reflected at the top of an organization.
Yeah.
Like, how do you coach people through that? Or what recommendations might you have if you're like, no one looks like me up there? What do I do?
I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I'm thinking back to my first time I went to I've been very lucky to travel lots of different places over the years, and there's a number of things that stand out for me. And it's times when I felt uneasy. So I remember the first time I went to Africa, and I went to Zimbabwe, and I remember getting off the plane in Harare, and I and my wife were the only white people because we were surrounded by Africans who were looking after us and there. And I went into the city in Harare, and in Harare in the 1998. I should remember, it's my wedding anniversary. So 1998, Harare is a very different place to it was now, but there weren't a lot of white people there. And I felt slightly intimidated at times, and I admit that now. And then I think fast forward a few years later, I did some work in Qatar in the Middle East. And I'm quite adventurous. And I think, if you look at 6 human needs we often talk about, one of the needs is for certainty, and one of those is for uncertainty. So I often have put myself in potentially dangerous situations to gain my level of satisfaction and uncertainty. So I walked around the streets of Doha, which, okay, it's a Middle Eastern city, a country, and it's relatively safe. But I was, again, the only white guy walking around those streets. And at the end of it, I thought, what danger am I putting myself in? And I wasn't putting myself in any danger, but it just had that impression to me. And I think about when you ask that question about if you're the only person on the board of a company and you're different, I wonder how it just provokes that sense of slight fear or unease in you about what is it you need to do and how do you need to prove yourself in some ways because you're the only one.
Yeah.
And I think that just changes that.
And there's a prove it again bias that often comes at play. It's been studied. It's very real that people that look different, women, people of color, those with disabilities, LGBTQ, list goes on.
Yeah.
But depending on your dimension of difference, if you feel different than the majority group, oftentimes you feel like you have to prove yourself not once, but twice, and sometimes 3 times, because no one's seen someone like you perform at that level. And so there's this extra question mark around you when you very much done the same or more.
Yeah.
A lot of Black colleagues, when we do listening sessions, will say, I have to work 10 times as hard to get the same opportunities. So I think we think there's this myth of meritocracy, right? We think everything's fair. The road I went down, you went down, like we're all like marching together, right? And then there's these like little biases and these little barriers that hold people back that are so subtle.
Yeah.
Right? So subtle, those conversations. I'm curious, Phil, doing what you do with leadership development and coaching, what might you recommend for leaders that want to be more inclusive, but maybe don't know how to start? You talked about those 6 factors. I'm curious how we could apply the lens of inclusion. How might you coach or suggest folks get more inclusive?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, and I don't have all the answers. And I think, the simplest answer is actually people need to come to people like you, Julie, who have got the toolkit. So that's throwing the ball back in terms of what you've got next bit, when you've got a whole lot of resources there for people to research. But the key is they've got to be wanting to do that in the first place. They've got to step up. And I think, if I think about the businesses I work in, I probably work in a traditionally white middle class businesses. I work with entrepreneurs, and I've probably stepped into those boardrooms or into those rooms, recognizing actually there's very few women in those rooms. There's often very few people of color in those rooms. So I'm thinking about the company I've worked in the last few years. There's very, very little diversity, actually. And I think the key is you've got to be willing. It's a bit like, I'm going to use this analogy. I'm not sure if this is the right one, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous. You've got to recognize there's a problem in the first place before you step into the room. And stepping into the room is actually quite scary in the first place because you're putting yourself out there and you might want to hide. And I think, using it as an analogy, I think from our perspective, we need to get people to recognize there's a problem to start with, and they are part of the problem and they're part of the solution. Because it's only when people recognize it, they can do something about it. Because if I just carry on and say, hey, it's all very well, we just look around, there's a group of men sitting around the boardroom table, and I just say, that's good. I then say, well, is it really? What do I need to do to change this? And I think it's about recognizing the difference and what we can gain from it. That would be my first thought.
Yeah. You got to define a problem. You can't solve a problem you're not aware of.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think that is it, as simple as that. And I think that the next thing is, I think it's a bit like calling people out on the behaviors. It takes a lot to sometimes say, that's not appropriate. When you've been putting up with things for years, Again, I'm going to come back to my youngest daughter. My parents own a canal boat. A canal boat, for anyone who doesn't know, is a 6'6" wide boat that runs on canals on the inland waterways in the UK, built 200 years ago. But the traditional people who run those canal boats, they're traditional people. And my parents built their boat 40 years ago. And on the back of the toilet door is a poster. And it's just a poster. And it's been there for a long time. I've always seen it. It was printed in 1978. And the only reason I know it was printed in 1978 is because when I took my daughter up to the canal boat over the last few weeks, my daughter sat and read the big back of the poster. And she said, "Daddy, this isn't appropriate." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Because there's a point about women on there." And I said, "What do you mean?" And it's got a flippant phrase, and it says about it's got a phrase about women, and it says along the lines of, and I'm thinking off the top of my head, it says along the lines of women come on canal boats to enjoy themselves too. So once they've finished the washing, the cleaning, and the cooking, let them have fun as well. And my daughter called me out to this. I thought, I've seen that for the last 40 years. I've done nothing about it. You see what I'm coming from? It's just there.
Yeah. Well, and especially there's so many markers in our culture like that have been around for so long that we don't question it. It fades into the background. We normalize it. We don't think to even question it. And this is what's so beautiful about young people. They question everything, which I love. Yeah. I wish we could put your daughter in a bottle and share her with like all the other people that need to understand, because you need somebody kind of poking at the fire to be like, no, this isn't right. Yeah. No, we need to change things. Yeah. And Phil, I'd love to talk more about your daughter, because one of the daughters, but in particular, sounds like your 15-year-old.
Yeah, 15-year-old.
Yeah, really a fire starter. I love it. I wonder, thinking about a lot of white men will tell me, well, I have a daughter. That's why I want to be an ally. And I'm like, okay. Yes. Step one is to empathize with women. And if you happen to know women close to you and your family, that is a great starting place. But by all means, not the only starting place. So I'm curious, if men don't have a daughter, or they do, but they don't know how to talk to their daughters about this. Like, how could you be an ally if you don't have access to somebody?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. I think so. Really interesting question. I think there's two things. So I think being an ally is about, if you think about diversity and inclusion, and you've taught me a lot more about this than I know actually, Julie. But I think the key here is, diversity and inclusion is about all of the aspects. It's about gender, it's about race, it's about disability, and it's about bringing everyone to make sure everyone, we're all normal in the eyes of whoever it be. So actually, why should we see people as different? And I think your question there is, if we don't have a daughter, what do we do? I think there's a lot of issues around some of these questions around, how do you step out and have that conversation with people? So I used to be on the executive of a scout group in the UK, and I think there's things there where we can actually reach out to young people and help them address issues. So as a member of the scout group, I was with them, and I was privileged to work with these young people to see them doing things. Now, majority were boys at the time. And I think about even scouting in the UK, there's still the Girl Guides and the Scouts. There's a difference. And some girls want that. But I think the question you asked was, how do we do it if we haven't got a daughter? And I think it's probably reaching out to groups, it's working with them, it's just being aware of that difference. And I think that from my perspective, I live in a very small area, but actually it's finding those areas just go make a difference. Where can you do something different? And if you're noticing something, how can you do something about it? But I think one of the problems that comes to my mind when you're saying that is, I think sometimes people feel scared of doing something about it for fear of retribution or fear of what people might think of them. And that, I think, is the biggest worry. And I guess, from a coaching perspective, I hear myself saying that. And we use a tool in coaching called third-party language. So when I hear myself saying they, I'm actually saying me. Yeah.
Oh, that's one of my favorite, like almost Jedi mind tricks from coaching, was like to get people to think outside themselves. They come up with better ideas if they're associated with somebody else versus it's like, well, if your best friend was here, what would they say? And suddenly they have all these ideas. But it's a really good point. If someone does say they've internalized that belief. They're just projecting it on someone else to feel more safe and protect their ego. Yes. Right. But that fear. We talk about this a lot on the podcast. People fear what they don't understand. People fear change because as human beings, we are wired to keep things safe because that keeps us safe. We're not going to die. But that's a very extreme viewpoint from
Yeah. Yeah.
evolution. That's not so helpful in our world today.
Yeah.
And our brain still kind of works in that primitive protection mode. Um, and also, you bring up kind of a zero-sum game mentality that can often happen. I think, especially with white men, like, well, we're all up here, like we've got all the power, like so now we're going to give it up. And
Mhm.
it's more about sharing the power than giving the power away. And I
Yeah.
just wonder if we could shift our language a little bit to be more about power with instead of power over.
That's
Wouldn't that be
interesting.
like better for everybody? Like,
Yeah.
wouldn't that like take a little bit of the pressure off men too? It's like,
Yeah.
have to do all this. Like, women, people have got like we can all come together, and guess what? We're going to achieve more together because we're going to
Yeah.
have different perspectives too. So
I
sometimes
love
it's
that.
just flipping this narrative.
Yeah.
But that's a
Yeah.
really interesting window into, of course, the people you coach and that the reality of the situation we have. Well, in wrapping up, Phil, I would love to hear from you more about what you do, how our listeners can connect with you, the types of tools and services you provide. Give us a bit of a sneak peek into your world.
Okay, and I will do, and I'm going to do it by answering just or bring in one last point to what you raised just now, and you said about sharing the power and power with. I think a lot of the work I do is actually about engaging people in your organization. Because if you're the owner of an organization, if you're the entrepreneur or founder, you want people to come to work willingly for you, and you want them to be on the bus because they want to be on the bus. And I think there's a big movement, especially we're talking about diversity and inclusion here, about bringing in inequality, and I think younger people are coming into the workforce thick and fast, so to speak. Us oldies, 50 years old and plus, and we're here, but we need to adopt that different language. And I think the word I bring in there is what I do is culture. How do I engage people around the culture? And we all know that culture starts at the top. It's the way the business is set up, is the way that other people do things. They see something happen, they think that's normal. So a lot of the work I do is helping you understand, what are the values of your business? What do you stand for? And above and beyond that, what's your purpose? Because I have a real belief that the businesses I want to work for are those that have a purpose above and beyond making money. Excuse me, above and beyond making money. And I think that's a key thing. How do I help people engage in that? So on my wall over here, I've got the 17 UN Sustainability Development Goals. And for me, I look at businesses from the point of view of how do you build those into your business that says this is what we're about? Because if you can do that, you can then get a group of people who want to be working for you. And it's the typical phrase I would use. If they buy into your culture and they buy into your purpose, they come to work with their blood, sweat, and tears. Otherwise, they just come to work for your money. And you build a better business by doing that. So my job is about coaching individuals, coaching CEOs, coaching leadership teams, working with them to help them scale. And I always say that my work fits into three boxes. So people come ask me to come in and change the business, and I can coach in box one, which is just about the content of your business. It's the stuff that goes on. We've not got enough sales. We've got problems with our culture. Box two is about the context. That's the reason that's happening, and often that's because we're setting the wrong tone in the business. But box three is where the change really happens. And I would say, from a coaching perspective, that's where the magic happens, because that's the personal beliefs and values that sit behind what you do. And as a coach, I have a privileged position to work with everybody I work with, I'm privileged to work with, but I work with some people with amazing minds. And it's sometimes tapping into their minds to help them understand what are their beliefs and values and how are they holding them back in some way. And I think when we talk about diversity and inclusion, part of this is around just opening their eyes to what could be. How could you work differently? Using that word, sharing the power, that's the key to it. So for me, if I can
Yeah.
help people share the power by being more open and opening their vision up to things, that's what I effectively do.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you have the social responsibility metrics for the UN up. And
Yeah.
really, organizations that have gotten clever at this here in the States, I think of Patagonia,
Yeah.
Salesforce, there's a few like rising star companies that have proven you do social responsibility, set up the culture right, and like your profits are better long term. So this isn't like running a nonprofit. I think people think that way. Like, I'm not running a nonprofit, I'm running a business for performance. And that's one of
Yeah.
the biggest pushbacks I get. And I'm like, yeah, but your business isn't performing at the level it could be if you're not inclusive and you don't have a culture where people want to work versus have to work, right?
Yeah.
Like that just intuitively makes sense.
Yeah.
But in practice, we still have kind of that old school mentality. So
We do.
need people like your daughter out there trudging.
Yeah, exactly. And I shouldn't, I pick on my 15-year-old daughter. I think, having two daughters, you see a bit different sides of them. But yes, we do need people out there like that younger generation who will open their eyes up and say, this isn't right. We need to change it. And are willing to stand up a bit like a Rosa Parks and say, this isn't appropriate.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we need.
Hold the line. Hold people accountable. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Phil, for sharing your voice, your candid conversations, and for being an ally in this work. I've learned so much from you on the time we've gotten to know each other, and I'm so thankful you were on our podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Lovely to speak to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you're on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our new signature Lead Like an Ally online self-paced learning program. It's comprehensive, and it includes an online learning platform packed with tools, stories, and ideas to become an even better ally. Head over to leadlikeanally.com to learn more.